All right, Scrafters, this is game 4 between Matticus and Ryan. This is a best of 5, and I'm trying to remember now. I think, no, Matticus is 2-1 up. I think that's correct, isn't it? Yeah. Ryan, our Terran player in the left of the map, and Matticus also playing Terran in the bottom right. Matticus choosing to wall off on the low ground here, and I like that. I'm always a fan of that. Just in general, I think that's not a bad thing to do. You know, you might not consider it because it takes longer to wall off if you're playing against a Zerg that you think is going to maybe try some sort of filthy 12 pull against you or something like that. But to be honest, most of the time it's absolutely fine to do this. This is Disco Bloodbath, which is from the sort of previous map pool, and I like Disco Bloodbath. It's a good map. As always, straightforward to hold your natural, but your third is actually really hard to hold. So you either take your third up here, and it's got access from here, or these rocks can be taken down to leave a lot of access to it. Alternatively, you take a third here, and it can be there's all sorts of ways to abuse that. You can get a siege tank in behind here and abuse it. You can, you know, it's a big area to push into. The third up here, let me just zoom out a little bit more. The third up here is, you know, if you are up here trying to defend against stuff, it's really easy to throw run-bys into your opponent's base with Hellions or any other fast unit like that. So the point I'm making is it can be difficult to keep a third and a fourth up on this map, and it tends to lend itself to those third and fourth bases getting abused, getting destroyed, getting poked, and that can lead to nice back and forth games. So Matticus with the much earlier expand. Oh, I said no, it isn't. I lie. Just little glib lies from me. Almost the same timings here from both. Ryan has completed the wall off, so Matticus doesn't get to see much, but does know that there's 2 racks. If he clicks on this as it's building, he will know that it's a reactor. So, you know, Tech Lab reactor with the 2 racks doesn't necessarily mean anything in this competition. Scan then goes down for Ryan, and he sees nothing with that scan. All he knows for sure is that his opponent doesn't have an orbital, only had 1 gas, but doesn't really know much. That would concern me. I would want to get a worker across the map to get some information. If I'd scanned and seen nothing like that, I'd be thinking either this is the case, or maybe it's a proxy or something terrifying that is literally just about to hit, and in which case I desperately need to know about that. You know, so if we look at Ryan's vision, he hasn't really looked over here or checked the, you know, because this would be a pretty normal location to put some proxy racks. Yeah, not sure what this guy's doing. Anyway, Matticus tech-wise actually has very little. You know, we're on a single barracks here, so he's feeling pretty safe behind his wall. He has done a little bit of scouting, but not so much. You know, this was the extent of his vision range. He doesn't know if there's another 2 racks over here. So, you know, again, neither of these players is really particularly well informed about what the other is doing. Not yet, anyway. So, yeah, if we look at the sort of army supply, you know, there's not really a significant problem at this stage, because I don't think anyone's about to move. Obviously, Ryan does have double the supply. He's got 2 barracks building reasonably continuously. But there isn't any tech for either player yet. And, you know, Matticus has got this bunch of Marines. Ryan's got a couple of Marauders in the mix, so it's a more punchy army at present. But I don't really think that that's of any significance. The combat shield is done for Matticus, and it's on its way for Ryan, so I don't think we're about to see either of these players get particularly aggressive. Both of them just looking to get their naturals saturated and looking to start choosing their tech path. It's Matticus, interestingly, that is first. No, or is it? Actually, the factory timings are, not dissimilar, but Matticus marginally ahead with this factory timing. We'll get the tech lab coming, and is also researching at +1. It is definitely, I think I've got it right this time, Matticus that is quicker with that third. But interesting that the natural isn't actually saturated, and there's no workers in production. So I'd like to see a continuation of workers. I'd love to see this orbital command, please, Matticus, please, the orbital command. So the factory finishes up, the tech lab finishes up, and I imagine we'll see some siege tanks coming out of that fairly shortly. Stim is underway for Ryan, but doesn't yet have a starport, but it is in production. Again, the factory's finished, but no siege tanks coming out just yet. Just as I say that, I think one has started up. So both of these players beginning to look very, very standard, look like they're just going to be going into a pretty normal sort of marine marauder with medevac's composition with siege tanks to add a bit of muscle to that sort of army. So Ryan at present still just keeping an edge in terms of army supply, and that might seem significant. It's not so significant if you're going to try and push into this location. You know, this siege tank up on the high ground here in siege mode would just decimate marines beneath it. So really quite difficult to push to get a frontal assault to work here. You do need to have reasonably overwhelming numbers, not just a small army advantage. You need to be well ahead to actually get that to work. So yeah, neither player has the sort of commanding army lead that would be necessary. I like what I'm seeing here from Ryan in that he's moved his army down into this lower position, and that just means he can defend this. If something comes in, he can defend this. He's not so far forward that things could sneak in around the back here, but he's in a good position to make sure that this can't be sniped, and I quite like that. Matticus has gone for the alternative third position, and it's personal preference really. I think this is easy to abuse, but arguably siege tanks positioned here and here can defend reasonably against stuff on the ground, and an army positioned up here is all you need really to defend it. This sort of feels quite far away from your men. It feels like a drop in the men over here from a medevac. Combined with a push through here would be very, very difficult to balance. It would be very, very difficult to split your units effectively. Unit splitting isn't really something I've talked much about, and it's not something I expect to see a great deal of in the EMS tournament. It's something that takes a bit of knowledge of the game and a bit of practice. Unit splitting, by which I mean just avoiding that F2 button. You know, if something does land in your men, looking at what it is, if it's a medevac full of marines, looking at it and thinking, how much of my army do I need to deploy to deal with that, so that I'm not just grabbing everything and running back into the men. Yeah, because once you're playing at a level where each side is doing a little bit of multitasking, double-pronged attacks are common. So you might push the front door with the bulk of your army, and you might send a couple of medevacs around the back for the sort of the backstab to gut the economy, in the hope that your opponent's attention is all over here and doesn't notice that they're losing tech structures, workers, etc. in the men. And the response to that, obviously, if you pull your whole army out of position to deal with the drop, you lose at the front door, and if you focus on the front door, you lose a lot in the men. So oh, there was the scan. The scan this time does see the army, and the scan up here also sees the tech labs, but I don't think Ryan actually sees the Banshees themselves. If you look, the limit of that scan was about there, and the Banshees I think were parked just out of range. But this should be a big giveaway. You see two starports with tech labs to either battle cruisers. These days, to be honest, battle cruisers more likely, or it's cloak Banshees. In either case, you want to have some turrets. You want you've got an engineering bay, I think. Oh, he doesn't. He doesn't have an engineering bay. Oh, he does. Duh. I do apologise. So turrets, you need a bunch of turrets. You know, turrets don't cost that much money. Both of our players have pretty good incomes. They're both mining off 3 bases. You know, so don't be shy. Throw down a handful of turrets here and there. Scatter them about in appropriate positions to protect your workers, ideally. To either protect workers, protect tech structures that are important, that type of thing. So, Ryan with the 4th coming up, and I don't know about this location for the 4th. I think I would prefer it over here. That is, for me, it's too easy for an opponent with medevacs to drop here, have a pop at this, and then just lift up and fly into the main. It's such a short distance here, but it's such a long walk around for your units, and you don't want to be trying to chase medevacs with your own medevacs if you can avoid it. So army supplies have remained pretty even. Matticus with the slight lead now. If we look at upgrades, we've got 1-1 actually in the bag for Matticus with combat shield, no stim. +1 attack for Ryan with the stim and combat shield, and also the concussive shells for the marauders. And he has got a reasonable number of marauders, and that can be really effective. He's also got a lot of medevacs, whereas I don't see any medevacs for Matticus, and actually that is a big difference. The combination of stim with the medevacs makes this army actually much more powerful. Reasonable number of siege tanks here, and a reasonable number of siege tanks for Matticus as well. So this fleet of Banshees could potentially get a huge amount done. There's no turrets in the main. These Banshees will surely you stop and just pick off the siege tanks. There's no turrets here, so actually Ryan has to defend with Marines. He does have one Viking, and that one Viking ultimately can kill all this stuff. Look at these, they can one-shot supply depots, but they're going to kill all these workers very sharpish indeed, and they could, in fact, I wouldn't mind seeing him focused on the engineering bay. You can tell that that's researching. Ryan drops the scan, but there's nothing in position to actually kill it. What he could really do with here is getting the Viking involved, and I would be inclined to start double Viking production from that. If you lift this command center up, remember Banshees can only shoot things on the ground. If you lift the CC up, it will survive. Unfortunately, hasn't survived on this occasion, so does need a scan or something to reveal these so that he can shoot them. But this is what I'm talking about, splitting the units. The entire army's coming over here. Now if he drops the scan now, this could be potent. Does drop the scan, and look how quickly these Banshees just fall out of the sky to that many Marines. So all of the Banshees go down, which is a shame. You kind of really, if you're microing these cloak Banshees, you should sort of predict that the scan's coming once the Marines are in position, and just run elsewhere, because ultimately you don't want to be standing fighting Marines. So Ryan decides to move out across the map. He has got an army advantage. The upgrades are not terrible. So it's going to come down to the way this engagement works. These siege tanks on the high ground are going to be absolutely critical. It's crucial really that he snipes these. What I'd love to see him do is just load everything into the medevacs, fly the medevacs, and just drop all the Marines on top of these siege tanks. Siege tanks cannot shoot things that are close to them. So the last thing you want to do is park here. He needs vision of this on the high ground. He needs to scan up here so that his own siege tanks can open fire. And he needs to stim these Marines in and get rid of these siege tanks. But I just think he's taking too much damage from above. I don't think this is going to work for him. He needs to pull back here. Matticus is sort of running about the place, but these Marines are getting just wrecked by the siege tanks above, and not really getting much done against this wall. So wasn't an ideal engagement. It's a shame. He had enough medevacs to simply lift all of his units and land them in the main, and that would have been a much more effective strat. He would have been on a level playing field with the siege tanks. Dropping Marines directly on top of them is really effective, because the siege tanks simply can't shoot them, and if there are other siege tanks that can shoot them, then those siege tanks are doing splash damage to the others, which is absolutely ideal, as the medevacs drop the Marines out one at a time. Matticus's own siege tanks would have been doing splash on each other. So you can clean up the siege tanks pretty quickly. Dropping your own siege tanks out of the medevacs and getting them sieged up in this position makes it really difficult then for your opponent to push up into their own base, because they're having to come through this choke. And if you've got some siege tanks up here, that's a horrible thing to have to do to get into your own base. And so what you'd find is you can probably just absolutely wreck everything doing that. Now, with all of that said, Matticus has got a fair few Vikings, and Vikings of course will snipe medevacs fairly quickly. So, you know, in any move like that, where it's generally referred to as a doom drop, where you just put an entire army in medevacs and fly it in. You know, any maneuver like that, you have to expect some losses. Typically, there's going to be turrets, there's going to be something that is going to be a problem, and you sort of think, well, it's a, you know, that's just an acceptable loss, that one, maybe two medevacs are going to go down on the way in. So long as once I'm landed, I'm going to establish a stronghold within my opponent's base, it's generally worthwhile, because you can just clean up so much stuff then. You absolutely got your opponent's production. You can, you know, all of this would be dead basically, and your opponent has a really difficult job of the unenviable task of having to like try and push up a ramp to get into their own base. So heavy losses then taken by Ryan in that push, but look, his economy is very strong. He's got expos in coming down up here and up here. I just wonder, has he got enough army to deal with what Matticus is sending across the map? I would love for there to be some medevacs with this stuff. I would love that. That would be so good. So needs to cancel this, because that is not going to make it that particular expo. What are we going to see in response from Ryan? He has got the smaller army at this stage, but look, he's got +3 on its way, although +3 armor is on its way from Matticus. So I don't think there's much significant difference in the upgrades. I will just check. 2-2 for Ryan and 2-2 for Matticus for the bio. Yeah, so very, very similar at present. Matticus does need to be careful. Ryan's expanding all over the place. What he isn't doing, the mistake he's making here with all these expansions, he doesn't have the production facilities to support them. So, you know, rather than what he's invested into building this one and this one, I'd much rather have seen several additional barracks or several additional factories come down. Ryan's army is poorly positioned. Look how, you know, it's all very spread out. So if Matticus pushes into this location, it's going to take a long time for this stuff to work its way down and try and defend that. As it goes, Matticus is just looking to snipe some of these outlying bases, and will probably have success doing that. You know, he can siege up in this position and annihilate that for free. This one siege tank is reasonably well positioned against stuff moving down in here, but it's not going to help this base. So that's going to go down pretty quickly, and this is sort of what I was talking about earlier. It is hard to hold these bases up here. This stuff is going to then filter down here. The siege tanks on the high ground can be useful, so Ryan might elect to just pull back some and let this army come forward into the range of these on the high ground. He's got a pretty good concave, but as the tanks siege up to the back, that's going to make a massive difference. Ryan, you kind of need to pull back and let this come into range of your own siege tanks. So that is an absolute slogfest right there, isn't it? And both armies absolutely decimated. Ryan sort of does clean it up. Matticus hasn't really got anything left apart from these tanks, so he's going to have to go home. Yeah, so I don't know. I wouldn't like to say there was a winner to that engagement. It was mostly losing. It's going to come down now to who can rebuild their army the fastest. You know, so we've got these 3 reactored barracks for Ryan. If we look at the mineral income, he's well ahead in that regard. So potentially he can get more bio on the ground pretty quickly. On the other hand, Matticus doesn't quite have. Oh, he does actually. He has 4 racks 2 reactored as well, but he does have substantially more factories. There's 4 factories here that he can be cranking stuff out of, compared to just 2 for his opponent. There's the same number of starports. So Matticus is probably in a position to spend his money a bit more quickly than his opponent. See Matticus flying the command center out here, and I quite like that as a maneuver. Once everything's mined out in the main, there's no reason to keep the CC here. You might as well fly it down and land it, and you can start mining straight away, then transfer your workers as he has done. So we're going to see a big old boost in his income presently, and given that Ryan has lost some of these outer bases, I think he's just transferring workers now to this one. There will be a period of time here when the 2 economies are roughly even, but obviously Ryan does have the potential to edge out in front. But Can he support it with his production? I'm not sure. I notice idle barracks. I notice idle factories. What's building here are Vikings. I think we're about to lose this base from Ryan again. So, you know, these bases are not free, and he definitely doesn't want to lose all these SCVs for free. Oh, no, please pull them back. Oh, that is ugly, isn't it? So rather than the big SCV transfer to a base that wasn't yet mining, rather than these guys long range mining, why not transfer them down here or here? Yeah, where they're going to get some stuff done. Ryan, you need to reposition your units a little bit. You need to make sure you're in a good chip to defend this. Siege tanks up at the front here would be useful. A little wall maybe here with some siege tanks behind it would be great. These siege tanks are in position, but they're not sieged up. Now, there's quite a few Vikings for both players actually, so the air battle is going to be interesting. It looks like Ryan's going to win that air battle, and that means his medevacs will stay safe. There isn't really any bio left on the ground. The siege tank's just driving forward into siege range of these ones. He's devastating. You can see that the bio on the ground is just getting, you know, it's a tank slogfest here, which does manage to clean this base up. The redeeming feature, I suppose, is these mineral patches are almost mined out, so this isn't actually that lucrative a base, but it does mean that now, look, Ryan is only mining off these couple of workers and these handful of workers, which is not so good. So the siege tank up top is good, but it isn't good enough to hold off this much in response. There's a lot of medevacs over here. It's a pity he didn't snipe those Vikings, because it was the Vikings giving Matticus sight of this siege tank up here that allowed it to be picked off. You know, this is not very much stuff. You can go and break this. You can just stim down there and just rush this and break it. It isn't that much stuff. Stim Marines are pretty good against tanks. But, you know, not if you're standing still. Matticus going ham here. You know, he's got a pretty good army. He's done a good job of rebuilding his stuff. He's got a reasonable amount of production. A lot of this stuff is just piled on top of itself. I wonder was it trapped behind a building or something? That Thor definitely doesn't look like it can get out at the minute, but I think he could lower these depots and it could walk around. He can always pick it up in a medevac and fly it out. So yeah, it's Ryan that's done the better job of resupplying, really, of rebuilding that army. But again, we're not desperately far adrift, but you know, Ryan, you've got these funny far-flung bases, and your army's all like pushed right the way back to your men here. There's very little in production, only 3 Marines building, and it's this mineral income that's the problem. Like, where are these guys going? Why aren't they going over here to mine over here? I'd like to see Ryan do pretty much what Matticus did and fly this CC down to this location so they can start mining, drop some mules and stuff and get involved. It's been a bit of a slogfest this game. There's been very little harass. You know, the Banshees earlier were certainly an attempt at some harass. And they did obviously snipe a base and get a little bit of work done, but I'd like to have seen more from both players. You know, we've reached this point and it's fairly low econ game. A drop in here, look, this is utterly undefended. A medevac full of Marines would just clean this up. A medevac, well, actually this is, to be fair, planetary, so Marines wouldn't fare that well against it, but you know, ultimately there's plenty could be done. A drop into the men or something like that could kill a lot of tech structures, although there's actually a Thor and a siege tank waiting. So it is Matticus with the bigger army at this stage. Ryan has nothing in production. Matticus has very little in production. He's going to try and move in here for the kill. Ryan moving forward into defensive positions. Now that you are in the men, siege tanks in this high ground are good. Matticus is going to check over here, I think, for the expo. There isn't one at present. I don't think he knows about these other bases. He doesn't. These siege tanks are going to have a good time, but they will not last long on their own. They need the support of these Marines and everything else. As Matticus's siege tanks siege up, it's going to be brutal. It's going to be hideous. And they're just going to annihilate everything beneath them there. Just gets an absolute shrecking. So a pity Ryan this time didn't have something sieged up on this ground. And in the end, it's Matticus that takes the victory. Good game though, good game. Things that we can learn from that game, because we are getting now to the finer points of playing StarCraft. We've got the hang of building bases, expanding, of putting together an army. You know, both players were getting into their upgrades. Both players had a fair amount of tech, were spending their money reasonably well. There was serious lessons to be learned in positioning, and one of the key lessons to learn as a sort of StarCraft player getting to grips with the game is to know when to run, to know when to say, this isn't a fight that I'm going to win, so I'll go home. You know, it's absolutely okay to change your mind. If you're pushing into a position and you suddenly realize, oh, it turns out there's 3 siege tanks on the high ground there, just run. Just, you know, save your units. Try and conserve the units that you've got, and just sprint off and just cut your losses and say nope, rather than slogging onwards. So, you know, Terran v Terran in particular is frequently just this festival of siege tanks slogging at each other, and it can be tricky because they deal out so much damage. Once you've got that, you know, Matticus toward the end of that game had sort of 10 siege tanks or something. That's just so much damage when they're sieged up like that, and their range is large. So what you typically have to do with your bio is either pull back so that you're out of range, or weirdly stim forward, hit the stim button, run your units forward. Stim Marines move fast, so as they run forward they'll only take 1 volley of tank shots to the face. So you'll lose a layer of Marines, but the rest of those Marines will make it to the tank line, and Stim Marines have a really high DPS, so they will just focus those tanks down ever so quickly. Yeah, alternatively, Banshees, Ravens, something else that's going to deal with those tanks. Anyway, it was a good game. GG.